Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third CME Palooza fall session. I'm Derek Warnick. I am back. I am pretty sure that the laptop is not going to crash during this session. I'm all reset and ready to go. So my apologies for the first session, but I think we got everything to work out. So we are, let me bring up the slides. This is our lunchtime session, which through our gold sponsor at Genentech, who we thank very much for that. Practical applications of TELMS. You're probably already doing it. Through our sponsors again, Genentech, our gold sponsor. Silver sponsors are Helio Education Lab, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, CME Matters, and ASIM. And Medical Education, Thistle Editorial, RMEI, PVI, Primary Care Network, Platform Q Health, Paradigm, MyCME, and Haymarket Medical Education, Connective, Impact Education, i3 Health, Highmark CE, Ethos CE, CMEology, Clinical Care Options, and ACHL. I don't know if anyone noticed, we did reverse alphabetical order this time to try and mix things up. No one probably noticed. Okay. Three ways to ask questions. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to send them our way. The first one is our newer way with the Google Slides link, which you'll find right underneath on the live page, which is right underneath the video where you have you'll see the video link there. Click on the one that says for Derek, since I'm Derek and these are my sessions. And it's really easy just to type in your question and I will be able to monitor it that way. You can also send us a text to our text line, 267-6660-CME. Those come to me, and so I monitor all the questions, and then I'll turn them over to the panel. And of course, you can always tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. Our speaker disclosure, opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are all of our own and do not represent an endorsement by or position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. Great. So at this point, I am going to turn things over to Rob Peters, Senior Vice President for Strategy at Micromass Communications, who is our moderator for this session. You can take it away, Rob.
Great. Thanks, Derek. And thank you, everybody, for your attention. We've got an interesting presentation for you today. Just by way of introduction, my name is Rob Peters. I work with a company that is a healthcare communications agency that uses behavioral science to change the behavior of physicians and patients. And we're joined today by two panelists. We have Andrea Harshman, who is the director from the Office of Professional Education at National Jewish Health, who is the senior director of medical education at the Global Academy for Medical Education. And what we're talking about today is the practical application of TELMS and the idea that you're probably already doing it. And if you're familiar with TELMS or if you're not familiar with TELMS, we're hoping to show you a little bit more about how the way that medical education programs are developed and planned really aligns with this interesting model. The TELMS model, it stands for the Expanded Learning Model for Systems, is a new framework for learning and behavior change that really accounts for the complexities that exist in today's healthcare environment, particularly in health systems. Part of working group in 2014, and it provides a framework that can help with planning, implementing, and measuring educational programs for both providers and patients in a health system environment. So today we're going to take a look at two recent educational programs for health systems and talk a little bit more about how they were planned and executed and how that process really aligns with the TELMS framework. So if we go to the next slide. What we want to do first is take a step back and talk a little bit more about education and the idea of behavior change. And Derek, I don't know if that slide changed.
It did for me, but let me try again. Sorry about that. How about now? Any luck? Oh, it just shut down. All right. This is the other laptop, of course. It's one or the other. I'll bring them back up again.
Okay. Well, again, we're going to take a step back and talk about the idea of education as a way to change behavior, because that's really the ultimate goal of any educational program, and CME in particular, is to change the behavior of a provider or of a patient. And whether or not that's changing the approach to managing a condition, getting somebody to think about a different treatment approach or a different strategy, or whether that's getting somebody to change the way that they talk to a patient. There's a lot of ways that we can go about changing that behavior. And one way to think about that is a simple behavioral model called the IMB model, or information, motivation, and behavioral skills. And this is a really good way to look at how programs are planned, and you'll see examples of this throughout the conversation today. Everything starts with knowledge. This is basic information, and this may be about things like disease and treatment awareness, just basic information. That it's the basis of many educational efforts, but it's really not enough on its own to change behavior. And that's why you have to add in the motivation and skills. Motivation really represents the personal attitudes that a person may have towards a specific behavior. And it's an important element to include in educational programs, or to at least acknowledge, so that you're more likely to accomplish that kind of behavior change that you're trying for. And the last element is the skills. And this is actually one of the most important. This is really ensuring that individuals have the necessary strategies or tools to perform the behavior. So it's a critical component that has to be present on top of that foundation of information and motivation if you really want to see those kind of lasting changes in health behavior. And skills are particularly important when you're thinking about the complexities of today's healthcare environment, or with unfamiliar behaviors. And with new therapies, new treatment strategies emerging constantly, difficult to pick up in a basic educational program. So thinking about behavior change and thinking about creating educational programs that incorporate these elements is an important way to address some of those challenges that exist in the systems. So now what we want to do is talk more specifically about the programs that Andrea and Mike have created, and see how they have been able to address some of those challenges and are using this model to provide successful and measurable improvements in behavior change in these environments. Let's go to the next slide. And Andrew, if you want to start off talking through your program with National Jewish, we can look at the kind of logistics of the educational initiative.
Sure. So our overall goal of our project was to enhance team-based care and improve the health of IPF, which is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, patients in an academic medical center. So we have a closed system. So our target audience were all of our physicians, nurses, and MAs who work with our IPF patients. The goal was, as Rob mentioned, was to create some behavior change around identified gaps. And we did that through a bunch of interventions, and we can talk about that later. But I'm not sure what else we want to talk about at this point as we kind of move through. Is that enough, Rob? Let Mike talk about his project and how it's a slightly different approach.
Yes, yeah, let's take a look and kind of compare that approach.
Okay, sure. So where Andrea's program focused on one center, we were focusing more on a national level. To do that, one of the key things, kind of starting from the bottom and working my way up, in terms of partnerships, we partnered with the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation to put together two different simulations using the Decision Sim platform. One was around diagnosis, one was around management of IPF, and then we also pulled together some enduring pieces from their PFF Summit, which is held every 2 years. So the goal of these two was really to help, kind of reflecting back to what Rob said, and I know we'll talk about it more later, but help the clinicians identify what they were doing wrong, kind of teaching them what they don't know, and then guiding them on what they need to do and how they can effectively diagnose IPF or treat IPF, or of course, if they're doing it correctly, reinforce their behavior. Partly through the simulation and showing what decisions they're making, either right or wrong, and then also through guidance from some top faculty, including Dr. Cosgrove at National Jewish, to give them guidance and teach them what they need to do or not do. And then we also partnered with Chest Physician for distribution of the program to reach a broader audience, which we thought would both help the foundation, which does a lot of great work, but then also include, also really improve the distribution of everything that we were doing to pulmonologists and to chest physician members.
And just in thinking about the partnerships that you formed, can you talk a little bit about what their motivation was in trying to address this? Do they have clear objectives, and who was it behind this that was really helping to drive the initiative and the people that you were working with?
Well, the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation does a fantastic job as a patient advocacy group, and I should include that their summit is a unique mixture of both clinicians and patients. So they bring them together in one place at one time. They have some plenary sessions where the two paths cross in terms of the educational sessions, and there are actually patients and clinicians sitting in the same room at the same time. So some of their main goals were to really improve the diagnosis of IPF. There's a lot of misdiagnosis that goes on, and patients aren't diagnosed for years and years and years. And then when they're finally diagnosed properly, they might only have 2 years to live, 3 years, maybe at best. And of course, in trying to treat them earlier, maybe that can help improve the treatment and how long they can live and the mortality rates. But then also on the management side, they want to learn a lot. There are new therapies out that have been just introduced. There are new guidelines out that have just been introduced. So a lot of this, in terms of this program and things that we're hoping to do with them in the future, looks at trying to identify what best practices are, what will treat patients most effectively, and how can we help improve patients' quality of life, because the quality of life is horrible with IPF, and how can we help them live longer with an improved quality of life.
Okay, thank you. And Andrea, I know yours is a self-contained system, but who is it that you had to work with internally to help kind of uncover that motivation to change in the system? Or what is it that was triggering them to want to pursue an educational program like this?
So we are an IPF Center of Excellence, and we have a lot of our faculty. There are 10 physicians involved with this initiative who are very just involved with IPF education, patient quality of life, all of those things. So Dr. Greg Cosgrove is one of our pulmonologists here at National Jewish, and Mike mentioned he was part of their initiative as well. So they're very involved, and they understand the gaps from a couple different perspectives, right? So kind of going out there and being educators around IPF, they're seeing what gaps are out there for community physicians and elsewhere. Then we say are in a bubble here at National Jewish Health, in that, again, we have these very committed physicians, and they know what they should be doing, and the gap we identified is, can we document that we're actually doing all these things that I know they go out to the world and say needs to be done for best practices in care, and how do we make sure we're actually doing that in our own home? And so that's really what initiated the project. I think we've all heard that, right? Docs kind of underreport. They think they're doing more than they can actually maybe show through their EHR that they're doing. And so through running some data on each of our providers to show, hey, maybe we're not as good as doing these things that we know are good for our patients, or at least not documenting it. And so the initiative really came up, and I know Mike talked about partners. We have partners within our institution. It takes a lot of people to make these systems-based change that we're wanting to do. So, our partners were all internal, but it went from IS to our quality committee, to the nursing staff, to the MA staff, to professional education because of the educational structure around it. So it really was driven by our faculty because they're so committed to really addressing IPF.
And Rob, I might want to add that Dr. Cosgrove is also the Chief Medical Officer of the PFF. So it was a nice tie-in there as well. Mm-hmm. And he could bring that expertise to both our program as well as the foundation. And it's been a nice parallel with Andrea's program.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, that looks like it provides a good overview of the motivation to create these. Why don't we go to the next slide, and let's take a look a little bit more at the specific goals within each. Andrea and Mike, if you can talk to each of these and go through a little bit about how you tried to address that need for knowledge and information, and what else was included there to help change behavior.
Do you want me to go first, Mike?
Yeah.
All right, Rob. So just talking about our goals and what we were trying to accomplish. really it was identifying the quality indicators for patient care, and then how do we implement processes so into our EMR, how do we track and make sure we're meeting those goals? That is a big part of the project. Improving the multidisciplinary team collaboration within our division. I mentioned the nurses, the MAs. I mean, it goes to the front, the front desk when people check in. All of those people are involved in how do we treat our patients. A big ongoing gap is educational tools. So part of this initiative is developing tools that can be used to really facilitate communications between providers and patients. All of that to helping to address the quality of life issues that Mike mentioned. So improving our patient communication is a big part of that. Enhancing the quality of life. And then improving the continuity of care through kind of systemized communication. That really is about, we're a referral center, so a lot of our folks are referred from around the country. And how do we systematize our communication back to their healthcare providers that may be treating them for most of the time when we're this referral center. So those are kind of those are a lot of big goals actually of the initiative that we're hoping to address.
Great. And Mike, how about your program with Global Academy?
Yeah, I think if you take it outside the center and look at how we can talk to clinicians individually, Andrea's talking to them as a center, especially a center of excellence, and we're trying to really drive a lot of knowledge and achieve a lot of the goals I've already mentioned. We were discussing the previous slide, to improve their skills, but then also change their behavior, shorten the time to diagnosis, improve the accuracy of diagnosis, improve the speed of the referral to a center of excellence like National Jewish. And then really we did a big patient component that I didn't mention before, where we did 15 interviews, 12 with patients, 3 with caregivers, to really just increase clinicians' awareness of IPF's impact on patient quality of life. We saw with one program that we've done already that they really underestimate how much this disease impacts the patients. And then one other thing I should add is really help them see what their peers are doing and help them learn from it as part of this discovery process of seeing what do they not know that they don't know. Part of that would hopefully be uncovered by going through the simulations, and then part of it hopefully will be uncovered to a broader audience by seeing what their peers didn't know in the simulations.
Okay, and if we bring up the next part of the slide here, I think what we've seen from Andrea and Mike is that there's really nice overlap with both of these programs in trying to address both that knowledge change and behavior change. Andrea's program had a lot of that awareness of the quality measures and quality indicators that are important to understand and address. But then there's a lot of skill components too, with really understanding how to improve collaboration and utilizing those tools. And Mike, you had a lot of the same type of things with raising awareness and understanding the new guidelines really fulfills that information or knowledge component, and building those skills and practical application is really critical for both. To the next slide, you can dig a little bit further into how these were put together and the learning objectives that we want to try to focus on. So Andrea, if you can talk through some of these objectives for the National Jewish program.
So, our objectives really were, I guess to go back to what you said, is addressing their skills in, there's all of these things that they need to do for best practices, and how do they fit that in, and then how do we make sure those things are happening. So Rob, maybe, because I can talk about this project, maybe more focus your question, so.
Well, why don't we bring up the next part of the slide and let's do this. Maybe talk specifically to kind of what you had included in the objectives to help the participants understand that gap and increase that knowledge, what it was that helped to drive the motivation, and then what you were really doing to help address that.
So I think the biggest motivator was was running the data out of our EHR to document these things that they identified were important with patients. So they saw their own gaps. So everyone is presented with their individual data and then kind of group metrics so they can see where they fall. So I think that surprised them. And obviously as physicians and wanting to take care of patients, that became a big motivator for them. So, you know, that and then just hearing, you know, from their peers, like, how do we do this better? So, and they knew that they could, and they have, by the way. You know, that's been a big motivator.
Okay. And what were some of the challenges with doing this in that systems environment?
So the challenges are, I mean, it's interesting. I just went to a meeting of this whole division of physicians yesterday. Right, so they all kind of have their individual approach, and there's still just gaps in what are the resources we have here as an institution and using them consistently. So it's still communication, I would say, that has been one of our challenges, which is, I think, ironic for how close-knit this particular group is, but it made clear it's something we still need to work on. So that's been one of the challenges. I think our EHR, everybody's, well, not everybody's is different, but there are challenges in how do we use that as a tool for communication, but to provide the resources. So there were some challenges there. I think we've overcome most of those, or at least found workarounds. I mean, those are, I think, are the big ones that I'm thinking of right now.
Well, Andrea, something I learned just in our prep for this was that it is not just a given that everyone's going to do what you want them to do. So I think you have
free will, yeah.
Yeah, well, a challenge in designing the programs that people internally, especially since you maybe see them every day, will accept and take on. Because I said at first that, oh, I was jealous. You know, you have great access to the EHR and to patients and the clinicians. You're like, well, it's not that easy.
Right. And not just because they're obstinate. I mean, they're real challenges that they deal with.
Well, and if you do it wrong, they're not going to want to do something that you're directing again. So
well, that's a lot of it. They have to be partners. I mean, I think, you know, as you know, folks in professional education, we come in and we have this great program built, and then they will throw a wrench into it, but did you think about this? And of course we didn't. And so that's, you know, I think you have to be flexible and really be open to any program evolving. Even in kind of online based programs I've worked on in IPF, and actually with Caroline's guidance, people weren't passing the test. We had to go back in and be like, wow, this is really hard. How do we address it? So we do it, you know, we're open to that in all of our educational initiatives, that we may not have had it all laid out, you know, perfectly at the beginning, but we can adjust.
Well, and I think understanding the gap is one of the most difficult parts. You know, what I kept referring to is teaching them, you know, what they don't know, and for you to be able to do that without insulting anybody professionally or in saying you're a bad doctor. That's certainly not what you're trying to do, and neither are we. So being able to use an EHR and use actual data is really helpful in that case.
They question it often, though. That can't be right. I did that. So, and sometimes you do have to dig in, and maybe we didn't pull it correctly. So, you know, you have to have them be really a part of making sure that behavior change is going to happen and that it's going to be sustainable.
Yeah, and Rob, I'll do your job for you. I'll segue over to mine.
Yeah, thanks. You can also kind of talk through how you address the knowledge gap there.
Yeah, well, we use the simulations to do that. So the simulations captured all of their data in a similar but different way than an EHR would. So as they're going through and diagnosing the patient and choosing the wrong diagnosis, and just for the record, our title of the program had to do with persistent cough. It did not mention IPF whatsoever, so we didn't want to lead them down a path to the answer. And so as we're collecting the data now, we're starting to see kind of what we expected and what some of the experts like Dr. Cosgrove taught us. They lean towards asthma, they lean towards COPD, and some of that's potentially appropriate at first because they because IPF's a rare disease and they should go to something that's more common, but they don't seem to know when to shift to something that might be more serious like IPF. So collecting that data and saying to them, you did it wrong, here's guidance on how to do it properly, it really encapsulates the whole knowledge, motivation, skill building piece, in that they did something incorrect, they learned that there is a gap in their own way that they practice. Learning that helps to motivate them as they maybe take 1 or 2 steps down screens in the wrong direction, and then they come back to where they made their first incorrect decision. They're now motivated to do it properly. And then using video of Dr. Cosgrove and some of our other KOLs to teach them how to do it properly and where they made missteps, and where these missteps are common. It's just not just them that's doing it incorrectly. Really helps to address the gap and helps them build their skills.
Great, thanks. And it's really interesting to point out that both of you and all the programs both of the programs that you're talking about have that same kind of model to follow of understanding the gap, driving that motivation with different types of triggers, whether that's something external like quality metrics or something that's intrinsic about wanting to do better for your patients, and then providing those kind of ways to address the gap. So the skill building and the self-correction, and then the kind of EHR-based understanding and practice in application and practice really helps to point out that addressing the gap. And I think for the audience, if you're creating programs that are following the same type of approach of helping to advance knowledge, drive motivation, and build skills, you'll see that it really aligns with the stages of TELMS, and you'll find that you're already practicing in a model that aligns with that kind of framework. So if we go to the next slide, there's a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. Andrea, there's a question about what kind of challenges you had experienced using the EHR within your program. I know you talked briefly to that, but if there's anything else that you'd like to kind of add.
Yeah, and I can't see the question, so I didn't know if you knew that. So I think the challenge with the EHR was working with, sometimes it's just getting in the queue to be a priority with our IST department. So we created certain order sets around IPF education and then certain metrics, and that's another question here. Which metrics did we use to share with clinicians and identify baseline practice? Can you hear something? Okay, so with that, our metrics that we identified we wanted to measure, and this might be getting a little disease state specific, but it was discussions around reflux. It was referral to an education class at National Jewish. It was oxygen titration, pulmonary rehab referral, weight loss intervention, nocturnal oximetry, 6-minute walk test, and immunization recorded. So those were the metrics. That's a lot of them. And again, a challenge with the HR was, how do you pull the data in a way that makes sense? There's a lot of determining the denominator, the numerator, and getting the right thing so you actually have an accurate picture. And that is where the faculty come in, because they'll be like, those numbers don't seem right. And then it'll be an aha working with our database folks on, oh, okay, I need to change, who I'm pulling, So those were just some of the challenges. Again, that's why it's important to get the feedback from the learners or participants in a QI activity. I hope that answers the question. There's another question here, and I don't know, I'll leave that to maybe Caroline to answer, or somebody else in the group, related to other models. But
and I have to apologize, Caroline, for not introducing you. One of our other panelists is Caroline Robinson. She's the Senior Manager of Medical Education with Learning and Clinical Integration with U.S. Medical Affairs at Genentech, and I think this is a question for you, Caroline.
Okay.
If you can help to simplify that difference between TELMS and other implementation science models.
Oh, wow. So we did not necessarily think about TELMS when we were designing it, and the group of folks were involved in designing it and reviewing it and helping further clarify it in necessarily an implementation science way. We were primarily thinking about how do we address the gaps that exist in the way we typically think about design models for learning interventions, and measurement models, and they're typically the same model used, design, and measure. And the gap specifically around the fact that the models that are typically used are either all QI, so they're all about a systems change, and it kind of ignores or doesn't necessarily highlight the learning role, or the model might focus exclusively or tend to focus more primarily on individuals. So how do, and if when we're thinking about change today, just as Andrea has described, we're looking at change from the perspective that it's about partnership of physicians, partnerships of teams, partnerships of folks within a system, and importantly, partnership with patients. And what kind of model could help us involve patients and clinicians in teams within settings and use that for both design and measurement. And so to the extent that we could use TELMS to design and measure specific initiatives, and then we could learn from that and translate that out, then it can be used for an implementation science approach. It wasn't necessarily how we started the construction of that. Does that help?
Great, thank you. And with that, why don't we move into the next section now, where we're really going to talk more about TELMS and alignment. And want to understand from both Andrea and Mike is, what is it that kind of drove you to plan out the programs in the way that you did? And did you choose TELMS specifically to drive behavior change? And you can talk through kind of your thought process and how you created these. So Andrea, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So to be honest, TELMS wasn't introduced when we developed this program idea and proposed it. So, you know, after it was introduced, I think in looking at it, and I think, you know, there have been sessions and different ways to kind of learn more about it besides reading the white paper, just realized that it aligned with what we're already doing. So this particular project was designed using the Plan, Do, Study, Act. So, and I think that's where we kind of came up with the title, right? Like, we probably are already doing it. And so maybe just having the discussion about the things that we've already been doing in program development and design kind of fit in. It just, I think it's some new terminology and we're all learning together. But really just as, you know, and this is a long initiative. So we've had time to kind of learn more about TELMS and know what we're doing and trying to align that so then the next time that we're planning something, it can be the forethought, not the afterthought, which it was in this case, only because it hadn't been created yet. So, so that's where I saw the alignment with TELMS. And, you know, I think, again, it's a learning process and getting on the same page with terminology to help us talk about these system-based changes that I agree with Caroline is a lot more than just a quality improvement. All of these educational modes help, I think, move the needle, and that's what we're all trying to do.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great example of how that kind of common thought process in creating the educational program aligns well with the model. Mike, how about you? Did you go in consciously thinking about using TELMS, or was that something where you recognized that alignment as you got into it?
My answer is exactly the same as Andrea's. Really, this program was put together before TELMS was formally introduced and then explained and follow up the programs like at Alliance. But we did have the concept of we need to improve knowledge, but then also build skill. And it was our thinking, if you look at that motivation in between, that's where we felt it was important to have them go through a simulation to see what they didn't know and help drive that wanting, that motivation to build their skill and continue to increase their knowledge. So when we saw the TELMS model come out, yeah, we said, oh, hey, this is really in line with what we're doing. How can we now, as we're continuing to develop content and working with the data that we're collecting on the back end, how can we see how that matches up with TELMS? And it matched up very nicely. We also have some follow-up programs that we are hoping to receive funding for that really look at the systems model kind of on a bit of a broader scale than what Andrea is doing, because it's very, very nicely set up that the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation has what they call their care center network, where they took 40 of the top interstitial lung disease centers, National Jewish being one of them, and built them together as a network. So it's a really nice opportunity for us to drive education out through them, through their network, to each of their individual sites, but also work with PFF to measure the impact of those programs on each of those 40 sites and see how they differ, see how the impact differs with each one, and look at it as not just an individual or a team model, but a system model. And TELMS certainly aligns with that as well.
Great. Let's take a little bit closer look now at TELMS. I think those are great examples of how creating a program in a systems environment really shows how the kind of common process and common thinking process and planning aligns well with the TELMS overall. Let's look at the particular stages in TELMS on the next slide. What we've done is really identified some questions that are important aspects to ask in each of these different components or stages of TELMS. So in Activate or Understanding the Gap, we want to really understand from both of you how you helped participants understand the gap that existed in the system. So Andrea, how was that done specifically in your program, or how did you go about kind of thinking about that when you were planning it out?
Right. Well, and I think I may have said this already. I mean, our faculty helped identify the gap. So when I say faculty, I mean they're faculty staff at National Jewish. And the understanding the gap was, let's dig into what are we actually doing in practice, and that's where the data came in. So that was, we think we have a gap, now let's kind of prove it. And we did, so I don't want to go on and on about that, but.
Right. Mike, I know you've talked a little bit about that as well, but if you can just talk to that particular aspect of your program, I think that'll help everybody understand how what they're doing may already align with the TELMS model.
Yeah, sure. And I don't think the repetition is bad in this case, because it's really reinforcing what we've been saying, that we're doing this all along. Yes, understanding the gap through what they do wrong in the two simulations that we presented to them absolutely helps them understand personally and individually what their individual gaps are. And then as we share that information with a broader audience, to see what clinicians, what the clinician gap is across the spectrum of whether it's PCPs around diagnosis or community pulmonologists around both diagnosis and treatment. And then for pulmonologists within an interstitial lung disease center, what their management, well, sometimes diagnosis, but also management gaps are as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if we look at the advanced stage, really addressing the gap, I think one of the interesting things, Andrea, with your program is how it's a little bit more of a direct application in practice. Mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit more about how your program specifically prepared the participants to take that action and what they were really expected to do in the system?
Mm-hmm. So I spoke of them being a tight-knit group. So they meet weekly and sometimes twice a week if they're involved with research as well. So those meetings allow the opportunity to really talk through what are we trying to do as a group, because they really do kind of practice as a group. So I think it really came kind of grassroots. What do we want to do? How do we want to make sure we are a center of excellence and do the right thing? And now we have this data on each one of us on what we at least can show that we did, and we know we can do better. And how do we do that? So they really help build the approach to take. What do we put into the EHR? What makes sense? Is that meaningful data? And so as a group, they developed those things, and really it was their plan on how do we address the gap. I will say not everybody is 100% on board with what we came up with, but I think there was compromise in how that happened.
Okay. And Mike, your program was kind of unique in addressing the gap through the virtual environment. Can you talk a little bit how you structured that so that it would really reflect what they needed to do to take action in daily practice?
I think a big part of that is getting the patients involved. The interviews with the patients were very eye-opening to Dr. Cosgrove, to others. The patient presentations at their PFF Summit really opened our eyes to how we could dive into this further. So, and it was nice, even at the summit, they sat the patients down in a separate room, even from the caregivers, and said, What are your issues? What are your problems? What do we need to solve? So taking that approach, that patient-centric approach, and building that patient perspective into the simulations was huge, because what it enabled us to do was say, patients have a horrible quality of life, and if you're not diagnosing them soon enough, that's just going to continue until they're treated, and it's going to be much more difficult to treat them. Using examples such as, it took me 5 years to get diagnosed. Wow, now I had 2 years left to live, potentially. I wish I hadn't wasted so much time. I wish I had known sooner. I could have done something different with the last few years of my life. Or even taking the patient story of, the nearest center that can treat me is 4 hours away. I have to load 4 canisters of oxygen in my car to get me there and back and be able to breathe while I'm doing it. So those are huge motivating factors.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move to the next slide and cover the next 2 stages, both Aspire and Allocate. And want to understand a little bit more about how each of the programs was able to help participants kind of deconstruct the actions and the behaviors that were desired and create that plan for addressing challenges and overcoming those obstacles in application. So Andrew, can you talk a little bit about what type of feedback was provided and how the participants were enabled to really create this plan to practice the solution?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that, at least here in our institution, the Office of Professional Education helps provide is some structure and project management help to do all of these things. So really it was, how could we help facilitate communication? So all of those metrics that I listed, right, involve another department. It's pulmonary rehab, it's our patient education group, and making sure we have the right education. So I think working with all those groups to now create the environment that they could practice this solution that we came up with, and that we're working on. Again, it's really about the system, and even as we dug in, I get surprised at all the people that have to be pulled in some way, shape, or form to make this all happen. And I know traditionally we target it at one physician, and that will make everything happen. And as you are working with all these other groups, you realize it is inertia. Like, it's hard to get that all going.
Great. And Mike, the same thing. What kind of guidance was provided for participants to help them understand how to put this into practice?
So I would say 3 things. One, at some point, even if they went down the wrong path in the simulations, they then had to go down the correct path. And so as they did that, that was breaking that down into steps for them to understand how better to either diagnose or treat a patient. Those were reinforced by guidance video guidance from the thought leaders, such as Dr. Cosgrove. We had a primary care KOL do the same thing for the diagnosis one, so we could have a PCP talking to PCPs. And then last, one of the things that we really focus on in all of our activities is breaking things down into the key teaching moments. So whenever we work with faculty, after we have a discussion about what should be included, we always end a call with, what are the top 3 to 5 things that you want to make sure people learn out of this? And those are always reinforced at the end of every program. So that was another key piece. So in the diagnosis one, for example, what are the 3 key diagnosis takeaways that if you had to take nothing else out of this program except these 3 things, here's what they are. And those are broader steps, certainly, but it's also the key steps that we don't want people to forget.
Great, thanks.
So Rob, I just wanted to say something that I totally forgot this and is critical, and I have not mentioned the person chairing our particular initiative is Dr. Evans Fernandez, and I feel very bad that I didn't, because he is the driver, right? He is the connector in all of these things. So, that is a big part of setting that up. So, right, they can work on practicing the solution. So you keep mentioning Dr. Cosgrove, and then I felt bad that I had not mentioned Dr. Fernandez. Who's doing all the heavy lifting, yeah.
Okay, and looking at the last stage, Allocate, is where the solution is really extended. And want to understand a little bit more from each of the programs is what was that kind of feedback mechanism? Were there metrics or measurements that were used to provide that trigger to help participants understand if their behavior changes were effective? And then how did you go about scaling that up? What kind of challenges were faced either within the system, Andrea, or outside for Mike? If you can talk to both of those. Andrea?
Yeah, so, extend the solution. I think whenever we're developing programs, we are thinking about, how do we make this sustainable, and how do we make it replicable? So, having now new order sets in the EHR is obviously going to extend the solution beyond the life of this program. The other thing that as a group, so a lot of our, I would say almost most of our faculty also do research, right? So they're always thinking about what can we look at, what can we make better, how do, so from that, other program ideas have been developed and actually funded that are extending this particular program, which is actually not done yet. But even in just what we learned, how do we take this out to the world? And really, it feeds off what Mike said around the patient. There's much more of a patient focus because they're an integral part of their own healthcare. And that became just even more evident in this project as we worked through it. So, we're still working on how do we extend it and do that effectively and in a meaningful way. But those are some of the things that we are doing.
Okay. Mike, how did you go about providing that kind of feedback and scaling that solution?
So 2 or 3 things here. One, the feedback is relatively immediate in the simulations, so they can see that if they change their behavior, the patient's going to be treated more effectively. So that's small but very important. The second one is, for me, taking data from programs such as this, especially the simulation where we're collecting data on so many different decisions and there's so many different data points. How can, instead of me just saying, oh, hey, Caroline, you were our supporter, here's what we learned, how can we take that instead to the greater audience and say, hey, physicians, hey, pulmonologists and PCPs, here's what was learned from things that your peers were doing. So to me, in the past, it's been a huge area that we've been missing in terms of education, to take this data back to not just the faculty, which a bunch of us do, but also to the learners themselves. So taking that to a broader audience through a follow-up program that will be coming out within the next few months that says, here's the core content, the evidence-based medicine, and here's the data that we collected, and put them side by side and show that to the larger audience. And then number 3, working with PFF has been, all along, has been incredibly helpful and critical to the success of this program. But to extend it, they will also be taking this data to the various sites within their care center network and using it as the basis for education for the next 12 to 24 months as we collect more information. So they can be a huge extension of us and taking it to sites that have committed to being relatively a part of PFF, and that becomes an incredible opportunity for us to do more education.
Great, thank you. And I think for everybody, those are great examples, and breaking it down this way, I think helps to understand that if you're trying to answer these kind of questions in planning your program, or if you're looking back at how you're conducting and implementing a program, you're really already applying and using the TELMS model. Before we go to any questions as we wrap up here, just wanted to see if there's any other kind of final comments from Andrea or Mike, just about how you went about planning the program and thinking now, kind of looking back at the TELMS model and how that aligns with your initiatives. Anything that you might change or that you might take as a learning to the next program that you do where you might apply TELMS?
Well, I think really just thinking about this beforehand. I mean, right now we're kind of retrofitting it in, but I think it will really help with planning in the future. I think it doesn't have to change a lot of what you do. I think if as a profession that we start to use some similar terminology, and I think that will take some time, that this is going to seem simpler. I think, I mean, I'll be honest, when I first read it, and I don't know, was it about 1.5 years ago or last year? it was like, okay, this is new. What is this? You know, so I think we're still sorting through it, but I feel like even just through the process of getting ready for this this webinar, this session, really looking at our other at the whole program, it's simplified it for me. So I guess I say that for people who are watching, that it's not as scary as to me at first seemed, just because I didn't understand it. And it was just like, oh, I need to take time and sit with this, look at what we're already doing, and how does this fit? And I think then as a group, it will start aligning us in what we're all trying to do in educating, you know, professionals in healthcare.
Great.
I would agree with that. I think my two key takeaways are the questions that Rob, you had put together, I believe, for Aspire, Allocate, Advance, Activate, for the different stages, helped me kind of almost midstream make sure that my programs address those. That really helped me better understand the different stages and what we were trying to achieve. And then again, midstream, when we had already developed this program or the concept and then started implementing the program, and TELMS was kind of dropped into that stream, it really got me thinking more than anything else just about the systems and how teams work together, more so than anything I had done before. So you know, if I had one key takeaway from this, it's think about the greater picture and the system. And if you're educating one physician and that physician cannot change his behavior because of restrictions within their system, for example, in this case, an ILD center, how can you help educate the center and all the people within the team to help remove those restrictions and help the whole team and the system perform better? I think it works better in some areas than others. Here, as I started working with PFF and found that they had a care center network, a network of systems, it was a beautiful, perfect match for what we were trying to do here and for what the whole idea of TELMS and the learning model for systems means. Some areas, maybe it's not going to work as well. Some broader areas that don't have as much organization or centers of excellence, that it might be a little bit tougher. Here, it just seemed like a perfect match.
Great. Well, thank you both for all of your insights, and thank you, Caroline, for your input on TELMS as well. We have time for a couple of questions, I think, and there's one question that's come in, just most literature on the IMB models, patient self-care, not clinicians, and that's true. Just getting back to how we introduced the idea of education and behavior change, the IMB model, it has been studied in patients originally, but we're really just using that as an example here of the critical components for education and behavior change. So no plans to publish that or apply that, and that's not necessarily an element that was driving TELMS. We're just using that as an example of the key aspects for behavior change. Questions from the audience, Derek?
I think that we have pretty much covered it, so I think we can wrap up.
All right.
If anyone wants, sorry, I kind of left that open-ended. If anyone wants to have any closing comments, and then I'll do my closing slide. Sorry.
I want to thank everybody for their time and attention. And again, thank you, Mike and Andrea, for sharing the details of the programs. And really the process running up to this has been very insightful for me, helping to understand from a little bit of an outsider perspective and putting these pieces together. It's been really interesting and enlightening.
Well, it was pretty cool to have an outside perspective too, because sometimes we get so wrapped up in our own world.
Right.
It's nice to hear an outsider perspective on what we're doing, and we actually learn from that too. So just the prep for this has been a nice learning experience.
Right. And finding out that Mike just moved to Denver, and so having a colleague nearby to bounce these kinds of things off will be good.
Yep, I'm in town.
Even though he's a Seattle Seahawks fan, we'll work on that.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I'm a Seattle fan from New Jersey living in Denver, so I don't know what's going on.
On that note, I'm going to close this session up. Let me bring up my slide. So thank you again to everyone. That was a fantastic session. And for all of you who are watching, please click on our survey to let us know what you thought, how many sessions you're watching. There's a link right on the live page to click. Literally take you 60 seconds to take the survey, so it's not long. Just a reminder, the next session is coming up in just a minute. And the next one is bringing innovation to the annual conference floor, moderated by Ann Krupe. And panelists, Carrie Smith, Janice Sibley, and Lisa Gutman-Greaves. You know, it's always a bad idea for me to try and read faculty names for people I haven't been working with because I can never, I never pronounce their names right. So just refresh your screen. Scott will have the link up soon, and I think that we're finished. Thanks to all of you for all of your work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.